3 years ago, my parents emptied my college fund to pay for my sister's dream wedding. They told me education was a luxury we couldn't afford, but a princess wedding was apparently a necessity. Last week, they showed up at my penthouse demanding money for their mortgage, and when I showed them my bank statements, they broke down crying. Not from pride, but from the crushing realization of what they'd thrown away. My name is Jessica Martinez, and this is how I went from having my future stolen to building an empire they never saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I was 18 when I first felt the ground shift beneath my feet, though I didn't recognize the earthquake for what it was at the time. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, the kind of day in Riverside, California, where the sun hits your skin just right and makes you believe anything is possible. I had just gotten home from my part-time job at the local coffee shop, my UC Berkeley acceptance letter still pinned proudly to the refrigerator like a golden trophy. The letter had been there for 3 months, and every time I walked past it, my heart did a little dance. Computer engineering at Berkeley. Full-ride academic scholarship covering tuition, but I still needed that college fund for room, board, and living expenses. $45,000 my parents had been saving since the day I was born. $1 here, $5 there, birthday money from grandparents, every tax refund carefully deposited. It was my ticket to freedom, my bridge to a future where I could build something meaningful. The house felt different that day, charged with an energy I couldn't quite place. My mother, Patricia, was bustling around the kitchen with unusual intensity, her auburn hair pulled back in a tight ponytail that made her look younger than her 48 years. She had that look she got when she was planning something big, the same expression she wore before surprising us with family vacations or major announcements. My father, Robert, sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open, calculator beside him, wearing his weekend clothes even though it was a weekday. He worked construction and usually came home covered in dust and exhaustion, but today he seemed alert, almost excited. Amanda was there too, which should have been my first clue that something was happening. My sister rarely graced us with her presence anymore since getting engaged to Tyler Richardson 6 months earlier. At 26, she had perfected the art of being perpetually busy with wedding planning, dress shopping, venue hunting, and all the elaborate rituals that seemed to consume engaged women. She sat across from Dad, her blonde hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the kitchen window, looking like she'd stepped out of a bridal magazine even in casual clothes. The three of them had been huddled together when I walked in, voices low and conspiratorial, the kind of family meeting that usually meant someone was in trouble or something expensive was being purchased. They looked up when I entered, and I caught a flash of something in my mother's eyes. Guilt, maybe, or determination. It was hard to tell with Mom. She had always been good at wearing whatever expression the situation required. "Jess, honey, come sit down," Mom said, her voice carrying that overly sweet tone she used when she was about to ask me to babysit the neighbor's kids or cover an extra shift at work. "We have some exciting news to share with you." I grabbed a water bottle from the fridge and slid into the empty chair, suddenly feeling like I was the only one not invited to a party. Amanda was practically glowing, her engagement ring catching the light as she gestured animatedly. Tyler had proposed with a 2-carat diamond that cost more than Dad made in 3 months, and she had never let any of us forget it. The ring had become like a 5th family member, always present, always sparkling, always demanding attention. "Tyler and I found the perfect venue," Amanda announced, her voice breathless with excitement. "The Grand Pavilion downtown. It's absolutely magical, Jess. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, crystal chandeliers, marble floors. It's like something out of a fairy tale." I smiled and nodded, genuinely happy for her despite the growing knot in my stomach. Amanda had dreamed of a princess wedding since we were kids, cutting pictures out of bridal magazines and planning elaborate ceremonies for her Barbie dolls. She deserved to have her dream day, and Tyler's family had money, so I assumed they were covering the costs. The Richardsons owned a chain of successful restaurants across Southern California, and Tyler drove a BMW that cost more than most people's annual salary. "That sounds amazing," I said, taking a sip of water. "When's the date?" "October 15th, Amanda replied, then paused, exchanging a look with our parents that made my chest tighten. "But there's a little complication with the finances." The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. Dad cleared his throat and leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped together on the table. He had the same hands I remembered from childhood, rough from years of manual labor, but gentle when he taught me to ride a bike or helped with homework. Now those hands seemed to be shaking slightly. "Tyler's family hit some unexpected expenses with their business expansion," Dad explained, his voice carefully measured. "They're putting most of their liquid assets into opening 3 new locations this year. It's a good investment, but it means they can't contribute as much to the wedding as originally planned." My mother jumped in, her words coming faster now, like she was rushing to get them out before losing her nerve. "We want to help Amanda have the wedding she's always dreamed of. She's our firstborn, and this is such an important milestone. We've been looking at our finances, and we think we can make it work." The knot in my stomach was expanding now, spreading cold fingers of dread through my entire body. I looked around the table at their faces, all 3 of them watching me with expressions that ranged from pleading to defiant. Amanda's eyes were bright with hope and desperation, Mom's were determined but avoiding direct contact, and Dad looked like a man about to deliver news of a terminal diagnosis. "The venue alone is $35,000, Amanda continued, her voice getting higher with excitement. "And that's not including the catering, flowers, photography, dress, music, decorations. We're looking at about $65,000 total for everything we want." $65,000. The number hung in the air like smoke, choking me. I knew what was coming before anyone said it, but I still wasn't prepared for the impact. When the words finally came, "We're going to use your college fund," Mom said quickly, like ripping off a bandage. "I know it sounds drastic, but hear us out. You already have the academic scholarship covering tuition, which is the most expensive part." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "And you're so smart, Jess. So resourceful. You'll find a way to make the rest work. You could get student loans, or work more hours, or maybe even take a gap year to save up. But Amanda only gets 1 wedding day, and we want it to be perfect." The water bottle slipped from my hand and hit the table with a hollow thud. Everything seemed to slow down, like I was watching this conversation happen to someone else. The college fund. My college fund. The $45,000 that represented 18 years of sacrifice, planning, and dreams. The money that was supposed to give me independence, opportunity, a chance to build something better than the paycheck-to-paycheck existence I'd watched my parents struggle with my entire life. "You're joking," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Please tell me you're joking." But I could see in their faces that they weren't. Amanda reached across the table and grabbed my hand, her engagement ring cold against my skin. "Jess, please understand. This isn't just about a party. This is about starting my marriage right. About showing Tyler's family that we're equals, that we can contribute. His parents are already skeptical about me coming from a different background. I need this wedding to prove that I belong in their world." "What about proving that I belong in mine?" The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't care anymore. "What about the world I'm trying to build for myself? Berkeley isn't just some random college. It's one of the top engineering programs in the country. Do you understand what this opportunity means?" Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Of course we understand, sweetheart. But education is an investment that pays off over time. You'll have your whole career to build wealth. Amanda needs..." This now, and we're in a position to help her. With my money, I said, standing up so fast the chair scraped against the floor. With money that was saved specifically for my education. That has my name on the account. Mom's expression hardened, and I saw a flash of the steel that had carried her through years of financial stress and uncertainty. It's family money, Jessica. Your father and I saved that money, and we can decide how best to use it for our family's needs. Amanda is getting married and starting a family. That's a bigger priority than your dormitory expenses. The casual dismissal in her voice hit me like a physical blow. Dormitory expenses? Like my entire future was just an optional luxury, a nice-to-have rather than a life-changing necessity. I looked at Amanda, hoping to see some recognition of how unfair this was, some acknowledgement that she was asking me to sacrifice my dreams for hers. Instead, I saw only the desperate hope of someone who had already mentally spent money that wasn't hers. "Jess, you're going to be fine," Amanda said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she'd used since we were kids. "You're the smart one. Remember? You'll figure it out. You always do. But I'm not smart like you. This wedding, this marriage, it's my chance at a better life. Please don't take that away from me." The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost admired it. Turn it around. Make me the villain for wanting to keep my own money for my own future. Make it about taking something away from her, rather than her taking something away from me. I had seen this dynamic play out countless times throughout our childhood. Amanda the charming one, the pretty one, the one who needed help and protection. Jess the responsible one, the smart one, the one who could handle disappointment and figure things out on her own. "The account is in your names," I said, looking directly at my parents. "There's nothing I can do to stop you, is there?" Dad had the grace to look ashamed. "We hoped you'd understand and support your sister's happiness." "What about my happiness?" The question came out raw and desperate, and I hated how young I sounded. "What about supporting my dreams?" "Your dreams aren't going anywhere," Mom replied firmly. "College will still be there next year, or the year after. But Amanda's wedding is happening in October, and we're not going to let our daughter start her marriage in debt or have a cheap ceremony that embarrasses her in front of Tyler's family." I stared at her for a long moment, trying to reconcile. This woman with the mother who had helped me with science fair projects, who had driven me to robotics competitions, who had told me I could be anything I wanted to be if I worked hard enough. That mother seemed to have been replaced by someone who saw my future as negotiable, my dreams as postponable, my needs as secondary to maintaining family appearances. "When?" I asked quietly. "When what?" Amanda replied, though I could tell she knew exactly what I was asking. "When are you taking the money?" Dad consulted his calculator, avoiding my eyes. "We need to put down the deposit next week to secure the venue. That's $15,000. The rest will be withdrawn over the next few months as payments come due." Next week. 7 days to say goodbye to everything I had worked toward, everything I had planned, everything I had believed about my place in this family. I nodded slowly, feeling something fundamental shift inside me, like a door closing that would never open again. "Is there anything I can say that would change your minds?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from their faces. "We're asking you to be the bigger person here," Mom said, reaching out to touch my arm. I pulled back before she could make contact. "We're asking you to think about what's best for the family as a whole." "What's best for Amanda?" I corrected. "Let's be honest about what this is." The silence that followed felt like falling. I looked around the table one more time, memorizing their faces, the kitchen where I had eaten breakfast every morning for 18 years, the refrigerator with my acceptance letter still proudly displayed. Everything looked the same, but I knew nothing would ever be the same again. I walked to the refrigerator and carefully unpinned the Berkeley letter, folding it in half and slipping it into my pocket. The small gesture felt monumental, like taking down a flag of surrender. "I'm going to work," I announced, grabbing my keys from the counter. "Jess, wait," Amanda called after me. "Don't be like this. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I paused at the kitchen doorway and turned back to face my family. They looked smaller suddenly, sitting around that table with their calculations and justifications, planning to spend money that represented years of my babysitting earnings, birthday gifts, and Christmas cash that I had dutifully handed over to be added to my college fund. Money I had trusted them to protect and preserve for my future. "Harder than it has to be?" I repeated, my voice steady now, calm in a way that surprised me. "You're stealing my future to pay for a party, and you're worried about me making it hard." "It's not stealing," Mom protested. "It's family investment. It's supporting each other." "No," I said quietly. "Supporting each other would be finding another way. This is choosing your favorite daughter over your other daughter, and we all know it." I left before they could respond, walking out into the riverside afternoon that suddenly felt different, changed in some fundamental way. The sun was still shining, the neighbors were still going about their lives, but I felt like I was walking through a world where all the rules had shifted when I wasn't looking. At the coffee shop, I worked my shift in a daze, going through the motions of taking orders and making drinks, while my mind raced through possibilities and calculations. Student. Loans would cover some expenses, but not enough. I could work full-time instead of part-time, but that would impact my studies. I could defer admission for a year, but there was no guarantee the scholarship would wait, and no guarantee my parents wouldn't find another use for whatever money I managed to save. My manager, Sarah, noticed my distraction around hour 3. "Everything okay, Jess? You seem like you're somewhere else today." I almost told her everything right then, the whole story spilling out over the espresso machine and pastry display. But something held me back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the growing realization that complaining wouldn't change anything. The money would be gone regardless of how many people knew about it or sympathized with my situation. "Just family stuff," I said instead, forcing a smile. "Nothing I can't handle." But as I drove home that evening, I wasn't sure I believed my own words. The Berkeley dream felt like it was slipping away, along with everything I had assumed about my family and my place in it. Amanda's wedding was still 5 months away, but somehow I knew that the real damage had already been done in those 10 minutes around the kitchen table. The worst part wasn't even the money, though that hurt enough. The worst part was the casual way they had dismissed my dreams as less important, less urgent, less worthy of family sacrifice than Amanda's desire for a perfect wedding day. The worst part was realizing that I had never really been the daughter they were willing to invest in, just the daughter they expected to figure things out on her own. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and made a decision that would change everything. If they weren't going to invest in my future, I would have to do it myself. If they thought I was smart enough to figure it out on my own, then I would prove them right in ways they never imagined. I would find another path to success, one that didn't depend on their support or approval or college fund. I just had no idea yet how far that path would take me, or how much my family would regret the choice they had made around that kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon in Riverside, California. The next 3 weeks passed in a strange, suspended animation, like living in a house where everyone pretended an earthquake hadn't just torn through the foundation. My parents went about their daily routines with an almost aggressive normalcy. Mom humming while she made breakfast, Dad watching his evening news programs, both of them acting as if our kitchen table conversation had been about something as mundane as weekend plans rather than the destruction of my carefully laid future. Amanda threw herself into wedding planning with renewed energy, her excitement amplified now that the financial obstacles had been cleared. She spent hours spread across the living room floor with magazines, fabric samples, and her laptop, creating Pinterest boards and calling vendors. The house became a shrine to her upcoming nuptials, every surface covered with potential centerpiece ideas, menu options, and seating charts. She had transformed from my sister into a bride, a role that seemed to consume her entirely and justify every decision made in its service. I moved through those days like a ghost in my own home, watching my family's happiness bloom from the fertilizer of my crushed dreams. The Berkeley acceptance letter sat folded in my jewelry box now, hidden, away like evidence of a crime. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, but I also couldn't stand to look at it anymore. Every time I passed the refrigerator where it used to hang, I felt a fresh stab of loss, like pressing on a bruise to remind myself it was still there. The coffee shop became my refuge, the only place where I could exist without pretending everything was fine. My coworkers knew something was wrong but respected my silence, allowing me to lose myself in the rhythm of grinding beans and steaming milk. The work was mindless enough to let my thoughts wander, and they wandered to dark places during those long shifts. I found myself obsessing over numbers, calculating and recalculating different scenarios in my head. Student loans could cover maybe $20,000 a year, but the interest rates were brutal and would leave me drowning in debt for decades. Working full-time would mean giving up the academic scholarship, and without that, Berkeley became completely impossible. I researched other schools, community colleges, trade programs, anything that might salvage some version of my educational dreams, but nothing felt right. Everything felt like settling, like accepting a smaller version of myself to accommodate their choices. The worst part was the way my parents had started treating me with exaggerated kindness, as if extra helpings at dinner and offers to do my laundry could somehow balance the scales. Mom would ask about my day with forced brightness, and Dad would make awkward attempts at small talk, both of them performing concern while studiously avoiding any mention of college, the fund, or my rapidly approaching enrollment deadlines. One evening, about 2 weeks after the announcement, I was helping Mom fold laundry when she finally addressed the elephant that had taken up permanent residence in our living room. "I know you're upset," she said carefully, matching socks with unnecessary precision. "But I hope someday you'll understand that we did this out of love for both our daughters." The casual revision of history took my breath away. Both daughters. As if stealing from one to give to the other was somehow an act of equal love. As if I was supposed to feel grateful for being included in their generous sacrifice of my own money. "Both daughters," I repeated flatly, folding a towel with sharp, angry movements. "Interesting way to put it," Mom sighed, the sound heavy with practiced martyrdom. "Jessica, we raised you to be independent, to be strong. Amanda has always needed more guidance, more support. You've always been able to take care of yourself." There it was, the fundamental misunderstanding that had shaped my entire childhood. They had confused my competence for not needing love, my responsibility for not deserving investment, my maturity for being able to handle any disappointment they decided to dish out. I had been so good at taking care of myself that they had forgotten I was still their child, still someone who needed them to choose her sometimes. "Maybe I was strong because I had to be," I said quietly. "Maybe I was independent because depending on you felt too risky." Mom's hand stilled on the laundry basket. For a moment, I thought I had gotten through to her, that she might finally understand what they had done to the family dynamic years before this wedding crisis ever arose. But then she shook her head and resumed folding with renewed vigor. "That's not fair, Jessica. We've always supported you. We came to your robotics competitions. We helped with homework. We celebrated your achievements. You came to my competitions when they didn't conflict with Amanda's dance recitals," I corrected. "You helped with my homework after you finished, helping her with hers. You celebrated my achievements when they didn't overshadow hers." The silence that followed felt dangerous, charged with years of unspoken resentment finally given voice. Mom's face cycled through several expressions before settling on the wounded dignity she wore whenever anyone suggested she had been less than perfect in her mothering. "We did our best with two very different daughters," she said finally. "If you choose to see favoritism where there was just practicality, that's your decision." I left the laundry half-folded and went to my room, closing the door with deliberate gentleness. Slamming it would have given her ammunition to paint me as the dramatic, ungrateful daughter. Instead, I sat on my bed and opened my laptop, staring at the Berkeley student portal where my acceptance still glowed in official blue and gold. The housing application deadline was in 10 days. After that, I would lose my spot in the dormitories, and finding off-campus housing without a guarantee of income would be nearly impossible. I had been postponing the inevitable, hoping somehow that my parents would come to their senses, that the universe would provide some miraculous solution, that someone would step in and save me from having to give up everything I had worked toward. But sitting there in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by science fair ribbons and honor roll certificates, I finally accepted that no one was coming to save me. Not my parents, not the universe, not some fairy godmother with a scholarship wand. If I wanted a different future than the one they had mapped out for me, I was going to have to build it myself. That night, I made a list. Not a dramatic manifesto or a revenge plan, just a practical inventory of my assets and options. I had about $3,000 in my personal savings account from years of birthday money and part-time work. I had excellent grades, strong references from teachers, and a work ethic that had been forged in the fire of being the responsible daughter. I had a car that ran, though not reliably, and I had the kind of desperation that could fuel extraordinary effort if channeled correctly. What I didn't have was time to feel sorry for myself or wait for someone else to fix what had been broken. The wedding was in 5 months, but my life was happening now, and I refused to put it on hold while my sister played princess with money that should have been building my future. Over the next few days, I threw myself into research with the intensity of someone studying for final exams. I explored every scholarship database, every grant opportunity, every work-study program that might provide an alternative path to Berkeley. Most deadlines had already passed, but I applied for everything I could find, writing essay after essay about my goals, my challenges, and my determination to succeed despite obstacles. I also started looking into alternatives that had never occurred to me before: online degree programs, accelerated certification courses, apprenticeships in technology fields that might not require a traditional 4-year degree, but could still lead to meaningful careers. The more I researched, the more I realized how narrow my definition of success had been, how completely I had bought into the idea that Berkeley or bust was the only path worth taking. But even as I explored other options, the sting of injustice continued to burn. It wasn't just about the money, though losing $45,000 certainly hurt. It was about what the decision represented, about the casual way my family had decided that my dreams were expendable while Amanda's were sacred. It was about 18 years of being the good daughter, the responsible one, the one who didn't cause problems, only to discover that being good had made me invisible rather than valued. The breaking point came during Amanda's engagement party, an event that had somehow grown from a simple backyard barbecue into an elaborate celebration at the Riverside Country Club. The venue change had been Tyler's idea, or rather, his mother's idea, because apparently a backyard party wasn't sophisticated enough for their social circle. The cost had ballooned accordingly, another $5,000 that came out of my college fund without anyone bothering to mention it to me. I almost didn't go to the party. The thought of celebrating my sister's happiness with money that had been stolen from my future felt like a special kind of torture, but staying home would have been noticed, commented on, turned into another example of my inability to be supportive and family-minded. So I put on a dress, styled my hair, and prepared to smile my way through an evening that felt like attending my own funeral. The country club was everything I had expected and nothing I had prepared for emotionally. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, flower arrangements that probably cost more than I made in a month at the coffee shop. Amanda floated through the crowd in a flowing blue dress, accepting congratulations and admiring glances with the grace of someone born to be the center of attention. Tyler stood beside her in a perfectly tailored suit, his arm around her waist, looking every inch the successful young businessman ready to provide his bride with the lifestyle she deserved. My parents moved through the crowd like proud peacocks, introducing Amanda and Tyler to friends and relatives, telling the story of their engagement over and over with theatrical flair. Dad had cleaned up nicely in his best suit, and Mom wore a new dress I didn't recognize, probably purchased specifically for this event. They looked happy in a way I hadn't seen in years, basking in the reflected glory of their daughter's successful match. I lingered at the edges of the party, making polite conversation when cornered, but mostly observing the spectacle with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. This was what my future had been traded for, this performance of affluence and social climbing, this desperate attempt to prove that the Martinez family belonged in spaces like this. The worst moment came during the toasts. Tyler's father, a distinguished man with silver hair and an expensive watch, raised his glass and spoke about the importance of family, about how marriage wasn't just the union of two people, but the joining of two families with shared values and mutual support. He praised my parents for raising such a wonderful daughter and for their obvious commitment to ensuring Amanda's happiness. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. Mutual support, shared values, commitment to happiness. All of it purchased, with money stolen from their other daughter, sitting right there in the same room, smiling and applauding on cue like a trained seal. Then Amanda took the microphone, her cheeks flushed with champagne and excitement, her engagement ring catching the light as she gestured. She thanked everyone for coming, thanked Tyler for choosing her, thanked his family for welcoming her. And then she turned toward our parents. "I especially want to thank my mom and dad," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "They've sacrificed so much to make this day possible, to give me the wedding of my dreams. They've shown me what it means to put family first, to support each other no matter what. I'm so grateful to have parents who believe in love enough to invest in it." The applause was thunderous. People wiped away tears. Mom and Dad beamed like they had just been awarded the Nobel Prize for parenting. And I sat there in my borrowed dress, clapping along with everyone else, feeling like I was watching my own erasure in real time. After the toasts, I escaped to the bathroom and locked myself in a stall, finally allowing the tears I had been holding back all evening to fall. The worst part wasn't even Amanda's speech, though that had cut deep. The worst part was realizing that this was my family's truth now. Amanda was the daughter they invested in, the one whose happiness justified any sacrifice. I was the daughter who was expected to understand, to be mature, to put family first by accepting that I came second. When I finally composed myself and returned to the party, I found Aunt Linda standing by the dessert table, looking almost as uncomfortable as I felt. Linda was Mom's younger sister, a nurse who had never married and seemed to view family gatherings with a combination of duty and resignation. She had always been kind to me in a distracted way, but we weren't particularly close. "Hell of a party," she said when I approached, her tone carefully neutral. "Hell of a price tag," I replied before I could stop myself. Linda's eyebrows rose slightly, and she glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "Everything okay, honey? You seem a little off tonight." Something about her tone, or maybe just the relief of having someone notice that I wasn't. "Okay," made the words tumble out before I could think better of it. I told her everything. The college fund, the kitchen table conversation, the casual dismissal of my dreams, the way my family had rewritten history to paint themselves as loving, parents making a difficult sacrifice rather than thieves stealing from their own daughter. Linda listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee with unnecessary violence. $45,000, she said finally. Jesus, Jessica. I knew your parents could be thoughtless, but this is beyond thoughtless. This is criminal. The validation hit me like a physical relief. Someone else thought this was wrong. Someone else wasn't buying the family first, sacrifice for love narrative that had been forced down my throat for weeks. They keep saying, "I'll figure it out," I said quietly, "that I'm smart enough to find another way." "Maybe you are," Linda replied. "But that's not the point. The point is that they stole your future to buy your sister a party, and they're trying to make you grateful for the opportunity to overcome their betrayal." We stood there in silence for a moment, watching Amanda and Tyler cut their engagement cake while a photographer captured every angle. They looked perfect together, golden and glowing and completely unaware that their happiness had been built on someone else's sacrifice. "What are you going to do?" Linda asked. I had been asking myself the same question for weeks, and for the first time, I had an answer that felt true rather than desperate. "I'm going to prove them wrong," I said. "About everything. About what I need, about what I can do, about what I'm worth investing in." Linda nodded slowly. "Good. And if you ever need someone to remind you that this wasn't your fault, you call me." The party continued around us, all laughter and congratulations and bright futures funded by stolen dreams. But for the first time since that kitchen table conversation, I felt something other than despair. I felt anger, clean and sharp and useful. I felt determination, born from the ashes of everything I had believed about my family and my place in it. They thought I would figure it out on my own. They were right. I would figure it out, build it, earn it, and achieve it entirely without their help or approval. And someday, when they realized what they had thrown away for the sake of one perfect wedding day, I would be too successful and too far away for their regret to matter. The engagement party ended with more toasts, more photos, more performance of family unity and shared joy. I played my part until the very end, smiling and hugging and congratulating, giving them no ammunition to claim I had ruined Amanda's special day with my selfishness or ingratitude. But inside, I was already gone, already planning, already building, the life they had decided I didn't deserve their help in creating. As I drove home that night, past the familiar streets of Riverside where I had grown up believing that working hard and being good would earn me the love and support I craved, I made a promise to myself. I would never again allow someone else's priorities to determine my worth. I would never again mistake being overlooked for being loved. And I would never again trust anyone else to safeguard my dreams. The girl who had sat at that kitchen table 3 weeks ago, devastated by her family's betrayal, was gone. In her place was someone harder, sharper, more focused. Someone who understood that the world was not a fair place, that families could choose favorites, that dreams were only as secure as the person dreaming them was willing to fight for them. I had work to do. The morning after the engagement party, I woke up with a clarity that felt almost dangerous. The emotional fog that had clouded my thinking for weeks had lifted, replaced by a sharp-edged focus that made everything seem possible if I was willing to work hard enough and sacrifice whatever it took. I lay in bed for exactly 5 minutes, staring at the ceiling and mentally organizing my priorities, then got up and started dismantling my old life piece by piece. First, I called Berkeley's admissions office and officially declined my acceptance. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes, but hanging up the phone felt like closing a coffin on the version of myself that had believed following traditional paths would lead to traditional success. The admissions counselor was polite, but clearly confused by my decision to turn down one of the most prestigious engineering programs in the country, and I didn't try to explain the family politics that had made the choice for me. Next, I drove to the community college and picked up enrollment forms for their computer science program. It wasn't Berkeley, but it was affordable, and more importantly, it was something I could start immediately without anyone's permission or financial support. The classes were basic compared to what I would have been taking at a 4-year university, but they covered programming fundamentals, database management, and web development skills that could translate into real income if I was strategic about it. The hardest part was telling my boss at the coffee shop that I needed to increase my hours to full-time. Sarah had been understanding about my college plans, even offering to be flexible with my schedule during exam periods. Now I had to explain that those plans had changed without revealing the family drama that had forced the change. I've decided to take a gap year and really focus on gaining work experience, I told her, the lie sliding off my tongue more easily than I had expected. I want to save more money before starting college, maybe explore some different career options. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's actually really smart, Jess. So many kids rush into college without really knowing what they want to do. Taking time to figure things out could save you a lot of time and money in the long run. If only she knew how much money I was trying to save myself from losing, I thought. But I just smiled and thanked her for being supportive. The irony wasn't lost on me that the first person to praise my new plan was someone who had no idea it had been forced on me by circumstances beyond my control. At home, the dynamic had shifted in subtle but noticeable ways. My parents seemed relieved that I wasn't walking around with the wounded expression that had marked my face for weeks. But they were also wary, like they sensed that my acceptance of the situation wasn't as complete as it appeared. They asked careful questions about my plans, clearly fishing for signs that I blamed them for the change in direction, but I gave them nothing to work with. Community college is a great choice, Dad said over dinner one evening, his tone just a little too enthusiastic. You can get your general education requirements out of the way for a fraction of the cost, then transfer to a 4-year school later when we're in a better financial position. The assumption that they would be involved in my later educational decisions hung in the air like smoke, but I didn't challenge it. Let them think I was planning to continue relying on their support and approval. It would make my eventual independence that much more satisfying. Amanda seemed the most confused by my apparent adjustment to the new reality. She had been bracing for months of guilt trips and passive-aggressive comments about the wedding expenses, but instead found me asking genuine questions about vendor selections and offering to help with DIY projects. The truth was, I had decided that her wedding was going to happen regardless of my feelings about it, so I might as well use the opportunity to learn everything I could about event planning, vendor management, and budget coordination. Every skill I acquired was a tool I could use later, and every moment I spent productively was a moment I wasn't wasting on resentment. I'm really glad you're being so cool about everything, Amanda said one afternoon while we addressed Save the Date cards together. I was worried you'd hate me forever. The comment revealed more about her character than she probably intended. Not that she was worried about hurting me, but that she was worried about the consequences of hurting me. The distinction mattered, and I filed it away with all the other small revelations about my family's true priorities. I could never hate you, I replied truthfully. You're my sister. I want you to be happy. What I didn't say was that I had stopped expecting her happiness to consider my well-being, or that her definition of sisterly love apparently included watching me sacrifice my future for her comfort. Those realizations lived in a growing file of things I understood but didn't discuss. Truths that were reshaping my understanding of family loyalty and what I owed the people who shared my DNA. My real education was happening in the evenings and weekends, hunched over my laptop in my bedroom, teaching myself skills that weren't offered in any traditional curriculum. I devoured online courses in programming languages, watched YouTube tutorials on digital marketing, and read everything I could find about entrepreneurship and business development. The internet was a university without admission requirements, or tuition costs, and I threw myself into it with the intensity of someone who had learned that no one else was coming to save her. The community college classes felt almost easy by comparison. HTML and CSS basics, introduction to Java programming, fundamental database concepts. I finished assignments in half the time. It took my classmates and used the extra hours to work on personal projects that would actually challenge me. I built websites for local businesses, volunteered to manage social media accounts for nonprofit organizations, and started freelancing on platforms that connected clients with remote workers. The money I earned from these side projects wasn't substantial at first, maybe a few $100s a month, but it represented something more valuable than its dollar amount. It was proof that I could create value, that my skills had worth in the marketplace, that I didn't need anyone's permission or investment to start building a career. Every client testimonial, every positive review, every referral was evidence that I was more capable than my family had ever given me credit for. 3 months into my new routine, I moved out of my parents' house. The decision wasn't dramatic or announced with fanfare. I simply found a small studio apartment across town, signed a lease, and informed my family that I would be living independently. The apartment was tiny and located in a part of Riverside that real estate agents generously described as up and coming, but it was mine in a way that my childhood bedroom had never been. "This seems rushed," Mom said when I showed her the place, her voice tight with the particular anxiety she reserved for situations she couldn't control. "You're barely making enough to cover rent and expenses. What if something goes wrong?" The question revealed the fundamental difference in our approaches to risk and security. She saw my independence as dangerous because it removed her ability to influence my decisions. I saw continued dependence as dangerous because it gave other people the power to derail my plans whenever their priorities shifted. "Then I'll figure it out," I replied, echoing the phrase they had used so casually when explaining why losing my college fund shouldn't matter. "I'm smart and resourceful, remember?" Dad helped me move my furniture without comment, but I could see him calculating the monthly expenses in his head, probably wondering how long it would take for me to come home with my tail between my legs, ready to accept whatever terms they offered for renewed family support. He didn't understand that I would rather fail spectacularly on my own terms than succeed on conditions that could be revoked whenever someone else needed my resources for their priorities. The apartment came furnished with the basics, which was good because I owned almost nothing of value. A bed, a desk, a small table, and a kitchen that barely deserved the name. But it also came with something I had never had before: absolute control over my environment and my decisions. No one could tell me when to come home, what to prioritize, or how to spend my money. No one could raid my savings account for someone else's dreams or expect me to be grateful for the opportunity to overcome their betrayal. Living alone was harder than I had anticipated, but not in the ways I had expected. The financial pressure was constant, but manageable as long as I stayed focused and kept expanding my client base. The real challenge was the emotional isolation. The way independence felt like exile some days. The quiet moments when I wondered if I had chosen pride over pragmatism. Those doubts usually struck late at night when I was working on client projects, the apartment dark except for the glow of my laptop screen, the silence broken only by the clicking of keys and the occasional siren from the street below. During those moments, I could almost understand the appeal of staying home, accepting my family's version of love even if it came with conditions and hierarchies. It would have been easier to be the understanding daughter, the one who supported her sister's happiness at the expense of her own ambitions. But then I would look at my bank account balance, small but growing, earned entirely through my own efforts and decisions. I would read messages from satisfied clients, testimonials from business owners whose profits had increased because of websites I had built or marketing campaigns I had managed. I would review the portfolio of work I was accumulating, each project more complex and lucrative than the last, and remember that this was what progress actually looked like. It wasn't the smooth, predictable path that college would have provided, but it was mine in a way that felt more authentic than anything I had achieved by following other people's expectations. Every dollar I earned, every skill I developed, Every client relationship I built was evidence that I could create my own opportunities if I was willing to work harder and take bigger risks than people who had safety nets and backup plans. The wedding preparations continued in the background of my new life like a distant storm system, occasionally requiring my attention but no longer dominating my emotional weather. Amanda would call with updates about dress fittings and menu tastings, her voice bright with the particular joy of someone whose dreams were unfolding exactly as planned. I listened and offered appropriate responses, but the conversations felt like checking in on someone else's life rather than participating in my own family's major milestone. "You should come to the venue walkthrough next week," Amanda suggested during one of these calls. "The wedding planner wants to finalize the layout, and I'd love to get your opinion on the table arrangements." The invitation was casual, but I could hear the underlying need for my approval, or maybe just my presence as a witness to the beautiful event that my sacrifice had made possible. 6 months ago, I would have felt obligated to attend, to perform, the role of supportive sister, even if it meant smiling through another reminder of what my money had purchased. "I have a client presentation that day," I said, which was true but also strategically chosen. "But I'm sure whatever you decide will be perfect." The disappointment in her voice was subtle, but real. "Oh, okay. I just thought since you've been so helpful with everything, you might want to see how it all comes together." There was an expectation embedded in her words, a belief that my helpfulness entitled her to my continued availability, that my acceptance of the situation meant I should be grateful for the chance to contribute to her happiness. The same logic that had justified taking my college fund now extended to taking my time, my emotional labor, and my enthusiastic participation in celebrating what they had stolen from me. "I'm sure it will be beautiful," I repeated, keeping my voice warm but final. "Take lots of pictures." After we hung up, I sat in my small apartment and realized that I felt nothing about missing the venue walkthrough. Not guilt, not resentment, not curiosity about the space where my money would be transformed into memories I hadn't been invited to help create. I felt the particular satisfaction that comes from choosing your own priorities, from saying no to demands that masquerade as requests, from building a life that doesn't require anyone else's approval to be valid. That evening, I opened my laptop and worked on a project that would earn me more money in a week than most people my age made in a month. The client was a boutique marketing firm in Los Angeles that needed a complete website overhaul, including e-commerce functionality, client portal integration, and mobile optimization. The technical requirements were complex enough to be genuinely challenging, and the timeline was aggressive enough to require careful project management. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have had the skills to take on a project like this. A year ago, I wouldn't have known that opportunities like this existed outside of traditional employment structures. But sitting in my tiny apartment, surrounded by the life I was building one decision at a time, I felt more capable and confident than I ever had in my childhood bedroom, dreaming of a future that required other people's money and permission to become real. The work was hard, but it was the kind of hard that felt productive rather than punitive. The kind of challenge that expanded my abilities, rather than just testing my endurance. Each problem I solved, each feature I successfully implemented, each positive email from the client was proof that I was becoming someone who could handle complexity, someone who could deliver results under pressure, someone who could be trusted with important projects and real money. By midnight, I had made more progress than I had expected, and the client's enthusiasm in their latest email suggested that this project would lead to referrals and repeat business. I closed the laptop and looked around my small apartment, taking inventory of the life I was creating. It wasn't glamorous or comfortable or easy, but it was mine in a way that felt revolutionary after 18 years of being the daughter whose dreams were always secondary to someone else's priorities. Tomorrow I would get up and continue building this life, one project at a time, one skill at a time, one decision at a time. I would prove that intelligence and determination could overcome betrayal, that success didn't require family support or traditional paths, or anyone else's permission. I would show them all what they had thrown away when they decided that my future was worth less than Amanda's wedding day. But tonight, I was content to sit in the silence of my own space, surrounded by the tools and evidence of my growing independence, feeling something I had never experienced while living under their roof, complete confidence that my future was my own to create. 2.5 years had passed since I walked away from everything I thought I wanted, and the person staring back at me from the bathroom mirror of my downtown Austin penthouse bore little resemblance to the 18-year-old girl who had once pinned a Berkeley acceptance letter to her parents' refrigerator. The woman I had become was leaner, sharper, more focused. Success had carved away everything soft and uncertain, leaving behind someone who understood that the world respected results more than intentions, money more than fairness, and independence more than family loyalty. My morning routine had evolved into a precise choreography of efficiency. Workout at 5:30, shower by 6:15, coffee and market analysis by 6:30, first client calls beginning at 7. The penthouse itself was a testament to what focus and determination could accomplish when freed from other people's limitations. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Lady Bird Lake, sleek furniture that cost more than my parents' monthly mortgage payments, and a home office equipped with technology that would have made my college professors weep with envy. Streamline Ops had grown from a desperate freelancing experiment into a legitimate business empire. What had started as simple website builds for local restaurants had evolved into comprehensive business automation solutions for companies across 3 states. My app for inventory management had been downloaded over 500,000 times, generating passive income that exceeded most people's annual salaries every quarter. The client roster now included Fortune 500 companies, and my waiting list was longer than I had ever imagined possible when I was building my first website in that tiny riverside apartment. But the real transformation wasn't financial, though the numbers were certainly satisfying. The real change was in how I moved through the world, how I made decisions, how I valued my own time and energy. I had learned to say no without explanation, to charge what my work was worth regardless of client budgets, to walk away from opportunities that didn't align with my goals. The girl who had once begged her family to recognize her worth had been replaced by a woman who no longer needed anyone's recognition to know her value. The irony wasn't lost on me that my greatest professional strength had grown directly from my family's greatest betrayal. Their casual dismissal of my dreams had taught me to trust only myself with things that mattered. Their willingness to sacrifice my future for Amanda's comfort had shown me that loyalty was often a one-way street, and that self-preservation was a skill more valuable than any college degree. Their assumption that I would always figure things out on my own had proven prophetic in ways they never intended. Contact with my family had dwindled to holiday cards and brief phone calls, interactions scripted and superficial enough to maintain the appearance of relationship without the messy reality of actual intimacy. They knew I lived in Austin and worked in technology, but the details of my success remained carefully guarded secrets. Let them think I was scraping by as a freelancer, still figuring things out, still proving their low expectations right. The truth would reveal itself when the time was strategically correct. Amanda's wedding had happened on schedule 18 months ago. A lavish affair that generated exactly the kind of social media attention she had craved. The photos showed everything my money had purchased: crystal chandeliers, designer flowers, a dress that cost more than most people's cars, and a bride glowing with the particular happiness of someone whose dreams had been funded by someone else's sacrifice. Tyler looked appropriately handsome and successful. Their families mingled with obvious satisfaction, and the event was declared a triumph by everyone who mattered to them. I had sent a gift but didn't attend, claiming a business emergency that couldn't be postponed. The emergency was real enough, a critical product launch that required my personal oversight. But I could have delegated the responsibility if family attendance had been a priority. It wasn't. The girl who would have felt obligated to smile through her sister's wedding ceremony funded by her stolen college money was gone. replaced by someone who understood that showing up for people who hadn't shown up for her was a luxury she could no longer afford. The wedding photos arrived in my email a few weeks later, Amanda's way of sharing her happiness with the sister who had made it possible through her unwilling sacrifice. I looked through them once, noting the expensive details and obvious joy, then deleted the entire folder without saving a single image. Other people's happiness built on my loss was not something I needed to preserve or celebrate, regardless of shared DNA or childhood memories. But karma, it seemed, had its own timeline and sense of justice. The first crack in their perfect post-wedding life appeared about 6 months after the ceremony, when Tyler's restaurant empire hit financial turbulence that made national business news. 3 locations closed within 2 months, victim to a combination of overexpansion, poor market research, and the kind of financial mismanagement that comes from believing your own press releases. The golden boy who had seemed like such a perfect catch suddenly looked more like a cautionary tale about the dangers of leveraging everything on untested growth strategies. Amanda's social media presence shifted accordingly. Fewer photos of expensive dinners and luxury vacations, more carefully curated images that suggested domestic bliss without requiring significant financial investment. The designer handbags disappeared from her posts, replaced by vintage finds and budget-friendly fashion choices that she presented as conscious lifestyle decisions rather than economic necessities. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood the visual language of social media performance. But it was the phone call from Dad that finally brought their financial reality into sharp focus. His voice carried the particular strain of someone trying to sound casual while discussing desperate circumstances. The tone I remembered from childhood, discussions about late mortgage payments and unexpected medical bills. "Jessica, honey, how are things going in Austin?" The question was loaded with hope that I was doing well enough to potentially help them, but not so well that I might judge their poor decisions. "Things are good, Dad. Busy with work, but good. How are you and Mom doing?" There was a pause, the kind of silence that precedes difficult confessions. "Well, that's actually why I'm calling. We're going through a bit of a rough patch financially, and I was wondering if you might be able to help us out temporarily." The word temporarily hung in the air like a lie neither of us believed. Temporary help from family members usually became permanent obligation, and we both knew it. But I was curious about the scope of their financial problems, about how badly their choice to invest in Amanda's wedding instead of my education had worked out for them. "What kind of rough patch?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Another pause, longer this time. "Tyler's business troubles have affected Amanda pretty significantly. They had to sell the house, and she's moved back in with us while they get back on their feet. Money's tight with the extra expenses, and we're behind on the mortgage payments." The irony was so perfect, it felt scripted. Amanda, the daughter whose happiness had justified stealing my future, was now a financial burden on the parents who had sacrificed everything to launch her into a successful marriage. The wedding that was supposed to secure her place in Tyler's wealthy family had instead become the most expensive mistake of everyone's lives. "How much are you behind?" I asked, though I was already calculating figures that would demonstrate just how much their priorities had cost them. "About $8,000 on the mortgage, plus we've got credit card debt from covering some of Amanda's expenses when Tyler's income dropped. Probably $25,000 total that we need to catch up on." $25,000, more than half of what they had stolen from my college fund, now needed to cover the consequences of their choices. The math was almost poetic in its precision. "That sounds really stressful," I said, offering sympathy without commitment. "Have you looked into other options? Refinancing, or maybe Amanda could get a job to help with expenses?" "She's trying, but the job market is tough, and she doesn't have much work experience outside of planning the wedding, and refinancing isn't really an option with our credit situation right now." Of course Amanda didn't have work experience. Why would she need job skills when her life plan involved marrying someone wealthy enough to support her desired lifestyle? The same parents who had told me I was smart enough to figure out alternative paths to success had apparently never suggested that Amanda develop backup plans for her backup plans. I wish I could help, I said, and the lie came so easily that it surprised me. But I'm still building my business and things are pretty tight on my end too. Freelancing is unpredictable, you know. The disappointment in Dad's voice was immediate and profound. Of course, sweetheart. I understand. We'll figure something out. We always do. But I could hear in his tone that they were running out of options, that calling their financially struggling younger daughter had been a desperate move rather than a first choice. They had probably exhausted other family members, friends, and traditional lending sources before swallowing their pride enough to ask the daughter they had written off as financially insignificant. After we hung up, I sat in my office overlooking downtown Austin and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the particular satisfaction that comes from watching natural consequences unfold without interference. I could have solved their problems with a single bank transfer that wouldn't have impacted my lifestyle in any meaningful way. My monthly investment income alone exceeded their total debt by a significant margin. But helping them would have reinforced the dynamic that had defined our family for years, the assumption that my resources existed to solve other people's problems, while my own needs remained secondary. Instead, I opened my laptop and reviewed the latest revenue reports from Streamline Ops. Third-quarter profits were up 37% over the previous year, and the new enterprise contracts I had signed would guarantee that upward trend continued well into the following year. My investment portfolio had grown to include real estate properties in 3 cities, stock positions that generated quarterly dividends larger than my father's annual salary, and cryptocurrency holdings that fluctuated more in a single day than most people saved in a lifetime. The numbers weren't just financial achievements, they were proof of concept. Proof that intelligence and determination could overcome family betrayal. Proof that success didn't require anyone else's permission or support. Proof that the daughter they had dismissed as capable of figuring things out on her own had figured out far more than they had ever imagined possible. 3 days later, Amanda called directly. Her voice carried the desperate sweetness of someone who had run out of pride and was operating on pure need. Jess, I know we haven't talked much lately, but I really need to ask you for a favor. The why. Conversation that followed was a masterclass in manipulation disguised as sisterly vulnerability. Amanda explained her situation with carefully chosen details that emphasized Tyler's bad luck rather than poor judgment, her own victimhood rather than her complete lack of practical skills, and the family's collective need rather than their individual poor choices. I know you're doing okay with your computer work, she said, apparently unaware of how condescending that description sounded. And I was hoping maybe you could lend us some money to get back on our feet. Just until Tyler gets his new business plan approved by investors. The assumptions embedded in her request were breathtaking in their audacity. That my success was modest enough to be characterized as doing okay. That I would be willing to risk my financial security on Tyler's unproven business skills. That family obligation trumped the history of how my resources had been treated when family members decided they needed them more than I did. How much money are we talking about? I asked, curious to see how large her sense of entitlement had grown. Maybe 30,000? I know it sounds like a lot, but it would solve everything. The mortgage, the credit cards, and enough extra. For me and Tyler to get our own place again, so we're not such a burden on Mom and Dad. $30,000, 2/3 of my original college fund, requested with the casual confidence of someone who had never been denied anything she really wanted. The same sister who had watched our parents steal my future to fund her wedding now wanted me to voluntarily hand over additional money to fix the problems that wedding had created. Amanda, that's a huge amount of money, I said slowly. I don't have that kind of cash just sitting around. The lie was so enormous that it almost made me laugh. I had $30,000 in my checking account alone, money I could access with a single phone call. My monthly business income exceeded her request, and my investment accounts contained enough money to solve their problems several times over without affecting my lifestyle or long-term financial security. "But you're doing so well with your business?" she protested. "Dad said you moved to Austin and everything. Surely you could get a loan or something if you don't have it available right now." The entitled tone, the assumption that I should be willing to take on debt to solve problems I hadn't created, the casual dismissal of my right to make my own financial decisions, all of it crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity about who my family really was and what our relationship had always been. "I'm sorry, Amanda, but I can't take on that kind of financial risk right now. Starting a business is expensive, and I need to keep my resources available for unexpected opportunities and challenges." The silence that followed was long enough for me to hear the exact moment when she realized that her last hope for easy money had evaporated. When she spoke again, her voice carried the sharp edge of someone whose careful manipulation had failed to produce the desired result. "I can't believe you won't help your own family when we're struggling like this. After everything we've been through together, after all the support Mom and Dad gave you growing up." The rewriting of history was so blatant that it took my breath away. Support. As if stealing my college fund constituted support. As if prioritizing her happiness over my education counted as family investment. As if their current financial crisis was somehow my responsibility, rather than the natural consequence of their choices. "I hope you guys figure something out," I said quietly. "I really do. But I can't be the solution to this problem." We hung up without the usual pleasantries, and I knew that our relationship had shifted into territory from which there would be no easy return. I had officially failed to live up to their expectations of who I should be and what I owed them, and they would adjust their opinion of me accordingly. That evening, I treated myself to dinner at Austin's most expensive restaurant, a celebration of my financial independence and my freedom from family obligations. The meal cost more than my father made in a week, and I paid for it with a credit card that offered luxury travel rewards I would actually use rather than sacrifice for someone else's priorities. 6 months later, the inevitable finally happened. The house in Riverside went into foreclosure, and my parents were forced to move into a small apartment in a part of town they had always considered beneath them. Amanda and Tyler's relationship became another casualty of financial stress, ending in a divorce that left her with no assets, no marketable skills, and no husband wealthy enough to fund the lifestyle she had believed she was entitled to maintain. The news reached me through Aunt Linda, who had become my only remaining connection to family information. She called with updates delivered in the flat tone of someone reporting facts rather than sharing gossip, and I listened with the detached interest of someone following the conclusion of a story she had stopped being invested in years earlier. "Your mother keeps asking if I think you'd be willing to help them find a place to live," Linda said during one of these calls. "I told her I didn't think that was likely, but she seems to think you're doing better than you've let on." Mom's intuition was finally kicking in, but it was too late to matter. The time for family support had passed when they decided that my dreams were worth less than Amanda's party. The opportunity for reconciliation had expired when they called asking for money while still refusing to acknowledge how badly they had treated me. "You're right," I told Linda. "That's not likely." A week later, they showed up at my building, unannounced. The doorman called up to announce visitors, and when he said the names Patricia and Robert Martinez, I almost told him to send them away without a meeting. But curiosity won out over self-protection, and I agreed to let them come, up to my penthouse. I watched them through the security monitor as they rode the elevator to the 37th floor, noting how small and tired they looked, how their clothes hung loose like they had been losing weight from stress. When the elevator doors opened, and they saw my apartment for the first time, their expressions shifted through several emotions too quickly for me to catalog them all. The penthouse was designed to impress, and it succeeded magnificently. Marble floors, custom lighting, furniture that had been featured in architectural magazines, and a view of Austin that cost more per month than they had ever made in a year. But more than the obvious luxury, the space radiated the kind of confidence that comes from complete financial security. From knowing that every beautiful thing in sight had been earned rather than borrowed or gifted. "Jesus Christ, Jessica," Dad whispered, turning in a slow circle to take in the scope of what I had built. "What exactly do you do for a living?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. They had driven 8 hours from Riverside to Austin expecting to find their struggling younger daughter, the one who was barely getting by as a freelancer, the one who couldn't afford to help family members in crisis. Instead, they had walked into evidence of success so complete that it reframed everything they thought they knew about my life and choices. "I run a business automation company," I said simply. "Software development, process optimization, inventory management systems for enterprise clients." Mom sank into one of my Italian leather chairs like her legs had given out. "How long have you been living like this?" "About a year and a half," I replied, which was true if you only counted the penthouse. The real wealth accumulation had begun, much earlier, but I saw no reason to provide a detailed timeline of my success to people who had shown up uninvited to ask for money. "And you let us think you were struggling," she said, her voice carrying the particular outrage of someone who had discovered they had been played. The accusation was rich, coming from someone who had spent years letting me think I was a valued family member, while systematically proving otherwise. But I had learned to choose my battles, and this conversation required strategic thinking rather than emotional responses. "I never said I was struggling," I corrected. "You assumed I was struggling because that fit the story you wanted to tell, about the daughter who chose independence over family support." Dad was still walking around the apartment, examining details and calculating costs with the expertise of someone in the construction industry. When he returned to the living room, his expression had shifted from surprise to something that looked almost like respect. "This place must cost $15,000 a month just in rent," he said. $22,000, I corrected. "But I own it, not rent it. Paid cash." The numbers hit them like physical blows. $22,000 was more than Dad's monthly income from construction work, more than they had ever spent on anything except the house they had just lost to foreclosure. I owned an apartment that cost more per month than they made per year, and I had paid for it outright with money I had earned independently. "How much are you worth?" Mom asked bluntly, apparently deciding that subtlety was pointless at this stage of the conversation. I considered deflecting the question, but the truth would be more effective than any evasion. "About $2.3 million in liquid assets, plus property holdings and business equity that would add another few million depending on market valuations." The silence that followed was absolute. They stared at me like I had announced that I was an alien species, like the person they thought they knew had been replaced by someone completely unrecognizable. Which, in many ways, was exactly what had happened. $2.3 million, Dad repeated slowly, as if saying the words might make them make sense. "Give or take, depending on how the markets close this week." Mom's face cycled through, several expressions before settling on something that looked like grief. "We could have saved the house," she whispered. "We could have saved everything." The statement revealed the real reason for their visit. Not to reconnect with their estranged daughter, not to repair damaged relationships, but to access resources they now realized I possessed. They had driven 8 hours to Austin hoping to find someone who might be able to help them, and instead, they had discovered someone who could have solved all their problems without breaking a financial sweat. "Yes," I agreed. "You could have saved everything if you had made different choices 3 years ago." The reference to the college fund hung in the air like smoke, finally spoken aloud after years of careful avoidance. They both looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats like children caught in a lie they thought everyone had forgotten. "Jessica, we know you're still upset about the college situation," Mom began, her voice taking on the placating tone she used when she wanted to minimize conflict. But that was different. That was family money saved for family needs, and Amanda's wedding was a family priority. The casual reframing of theft as family investment, of my individual loss as collective benefit, demonstrated exactly why reconciliation was impossible. They still didn't understand what they had done wrong, still believed that their decision had been justified by circumstances rather than enabled by my powerlessness to stop them. Amanda's wedding was Amanda's priority, I corrected, and you chose to fund it with money that belonged to my future. That wasn't a family decision. That was a decision you made for the family without considering everyone it affected. Dad cleared his throat, the sound rough with discomfort. We thought you'd understand eventually. We thought you'd see that family comes first. That sometimes we have to sacrifice individual wants for collective needs. Individual wants, I repeated, letting the phrase settle between us. Is that what you call my education? My career aspirations? My financial security? We call it being part of a family, Mom said firmly. Being willing to support each other when support is needed. The definition was so one-sided that it would have been funny if it weren't so revealing. Support, in their vocabulary, meant my willingness to accept their decisions about my resources. It didn't include their willingness to protect my interests when those interests conflicted with Amanda's desires. Where was that family support when I needed it? I asked quietly. Where was the collective concern for my needs when you were deciding how to spend my college fund? They exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that comes from years of marriage and shared defensiveness. I could see them calculating responses, trying to find words that would justify what they had done without admitting it was wrong. We knew you'd be fine, Dad said finally. You were always the smart one, the responsible one. We knew you'd find a way to succeed no matter what obstacles you faced. The compliment disguised as explanation revealed the core misunderstanding that had shaped our entire relationship. They had confused my competence for not needing support, my responsibility for being obligated to handle whatever they decided to dish out, my intelligence for unlimited resilience to their poor choices. You're right, I said. I did find a way to succeed, without your help, without your support, and without your approval. I built this life entirely on my own, using skills and determination that didn't require anyone else's money or permission. The pride in my voice was unmistakable, and it seemed to hit them like a rebuke. They had raised a daughter who was capable of extraordinary success, then systematically undermined her until she was forced to prove that capability without their involvement. Mom's eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of regret or self-pity. We're proud of what you've accomplished, she said softly. But we're also sorry that you felt you had to do it alone. The apology was carefully constructed to avoid admitting fault while expressing appropriate emotion. They were sorry I felt alone, not sorry they had isolated me. They were proud of my success, not ashamed of their role in making that success necessary rather than optional. I didn't feel like I had to do it alone, I replied. You made it clear that I was going to do it alone when you decided that my college fund was available for Amanda's wedding expenses. I just chose to embrace that independence rather than fight against it. The conversation continued for another hour, but the fundamental positions never shifted. They wanted me to understand their perspective, to forgive their choices, and to help them solve their current financial crisis. I wanted them to acknowledge what they had done, to recognize how their favoritism had damaged our family relationships, and to accept that their current problems were not my responsibility to solve. When they finally left, I stood at my floor-to-ceiling windows and watched their rental car disappear into Austin traffic. They would drive back to Riverside with the knowledge that their younger daughter had achieved wealth and success beyond anything they had imagined possible, and that this success would remain forever out of their reach because of choices they had made when they thought she didn't matter enough to consider. That evening, I opened a bottle of wine that cost more than my parents' monthly grocery budget and toasted the girl who had sat in a riverside kitchen 3 years earlier, listening to her family explain why her dreams were worth less than her sister's party. She hadn't known then that betrayal could be a gift, that abandonment could be liberation, that being forced to rely on yourself was the most valuable education anyone could receive. The money they had stolen from my college fund had been invested in Amanda's fairy tale wedding, an event that lasted one day and left nothing behind but photographs and debt. The future they had forced me to build independently had compound interest that would last forever, generating wealth and opportunities, and security that no one could take away because no one else had been involved in creating it. They had taught me the most important lesson anyone could learn: that family loyalty was often a one-way street, that love could have conditions that were never clearly stated, and that the people who claimed to want the best for you might be the biggest obstacles to achieving it. But they had also taught me that I was capable of more than they had ever imagined, that intelligence and determination could overcome any betrayal, and that success was sweeter when you earned it entirely, on your own terms. 3 years later, I was worth more money than they would see in a lifetime, living in luxury they couldn't afford to visit, building a business empire they couldn't understand, and enjoying the kind of security and independence that their family model would never have allowed me to achieve. The college fund they had stolen had been $45,000. The net worth I had built to replace it was approaching $3 million and growing every month. The mathematics of justice, it turned out, had its own logic and timeline. And sometimes, the best revenge wasn't revenge at all, but simply becoming so successful that your success became impossible to ignore or explain away. They had bet against my ability to thrive without their support, and now they were living with the consequences of that bet, while I thrived beyond their wildest projections. The girl who had once wanted nothing more than their approval and investment had been replaced by a woman who needed neither. And that transformation, painful as it had been to achieve, was worth more than any college education they could have funded, or any family relationship they could have preserved. Some lessons could only be learned through loss, and some strength could only be built through abandonment. They had given me both, whether they intended to or not, and for that, in a way I would never tell them, I was grateful. The weeks following my parents' visit passed in a strange state of emotional equilibrium that I hadn't experienced since childhood. For the first time in 3 years, all the cards were on the table. They knew exactly how successful I had become. I knew exactly how desperate their situation had grown. And we all understood that the power dynamic between us had shifted so completely that it could never return to its original configuration. There was something liberating about the end of pretense, about no longer having to manage their expectations or protect their feelings from the reality of what their choices had cost them. My daily routine remained unchanged, but everything felt different when filtered through the knowledge that my family now understood the magnitude of what they had thrown away. The morning coffee tasted richer when I remembered the look on Dad's face as he calculated the cost of my apartment. The view from my office window seemed more spectacular when I thought about Mom's tears as she realized I could have saved their house with pocket change. Even my client meetings carried an extra satisfaction, knowing that every deal I closed represented money they would never have access to because of decisions they had made when they thought I didn't matter. The business continued expanding at a pace that surprised even me. 3 major enterprise contracts had been signed in the month since their visit, including a partnership with a Fortune 100 company that would guarantee steady revenue for the next 5 years. The app had been licensed to an international software consortium, creating passive income streams that exceeded my original projections by orders of magnitude. Every success felt like another nail in the coffin of their narrative about family, priorities, and collective sacrifice. But the real transformation was happening in how I related to the concept of family itself. For years, even after moving to Austin and building my independent life, some part of me had held on to the hope that reconciliation was possible, that they might eventually recognize the harm they had done and work to repair it. Their visit had permanently closed that door, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the simple revelation that they still fundamentally misunderstood what family loyalty actually meant. They wanted me to forgive them for stealing my future because they were sorry about how it had turned out for everyone involved. They wanted me to help them now because blood relation created obligations that transcended personal history. They wanted me to prioritize their current needs the same way they had prioritized Amanda's wedding 3 years earlier, except this time the sacrifice would be voluntary rather than stolen. The logic was internally consistent and completely unacceptable. True family loyalty, I had learned, was bidirectional. It meant protecting each other's dreams even when those dreams conflicted with immediate desires. It meant making sacrifices that distributed cost and benefit equitably, rather than dumping all the loss onto the person least able to resist. It meant having difficult conversations before making decisions that affected everyone, not after those. Decisions had already destroyed whatever they were meant to protect. My parents had never learned these lessons, and at their age, with their ingrained patterns of thinking about hierarchy and obligation, they probably never would. They would always see family relationships through the lens of who owed what to whom, who deserved support and who was strong enough to handle disappointment, who could be counted on to understand, and who needed to be protected from consequences. Amanda called 6 weeks after their visit, her voice carrying the particular desperation of someone who had exhausted all other options and was down to her last possibility for salvation. She didn't waste time with small talk or attempt to rebuild our relationship through gradual conversation. The financial crisis had apparently stripped away her capacity for strategic manipulation, leaving behind only raw need and diminished pride. "Jess, I know things have been weird between us, but I really need to talk to you about something important," she began, the words coming too fast and too sharp, like someone who had rehearsed this conversation but was struggling to remember, her lines under pressure. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make it clear that I wasn't going to make this easy for her, then responded with polite curiosity. "What's going on, Amanda?" "Tyler and I are getting divorced," she said, as if this information would somehow surprise me. "And my lawyer says I'm not going to get much from the settlement because most of his assets were tied up in the business when it went under. I'm basically starting over with nothing." The revelation was delivered like a tragedy that had befallen her through no fault of her own, rather than the predictable consequence of building her entire life plan around someone else's financial stability. She had married Tyler for his money and lifestyle, and now that both were gone, she was discovering that a relationship based on external resources, rather than personal compatibility, rarely survived the loss of those resources. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it in the abstract way you might feel sorry for a stranger's misfortune reported in the news. Divorce is always difficult. "Mom and Dad told me about your apartment," she continued, apparently deciding that directness was her only remaining strategy. "They said you're doing really well, that you've built some kind of tech empire. I had no idea you were so successful." The casual admission that they had all written me off as financially insignificant would have hurt 3 years ago. Now it felt like validation of every choice I had made to build my life without their input or approval. They had underestimated me so completely that my actual success seemed impossible to believe, even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. "I've worked hard," I replied simply. "The business has grown beyond what I originally expected." "Mom said you own that penthouse in Austin, that it's worth millions, and that you paid cash for it." Amanda's voice carried a note of wonder, as if she were describing something magical rather than the normal result of intelligent decision-making and sustained effort. "Real estate has been good to me," I said, offering no details about the investment strategy that had made such purchases possible. There was a pause, and I could hear her gathering courage for whatever request was coming. When she spoke again, her voice had taken on the pleading tone I remembered from childhood. the sound she made when she wanted something badly enough to abandon dignity entirely. Jess, I need help. Not just money, although God knows I need that, too. I need someone who understands business, who knows how to build something from nothing. I was thinking maybe we could work together. Maybe you could teach me some of what you know about technology and entrepreneurship. The request was so far beyond the boundaries of possibility that I almost laughed. She wanted me to become her business mentor, to share the knowledge and connections I had developed through years of independent struggle, to essentially hand over the tools I had forged in the fire of her betrayal so she could build her own version of the success I had achieved despite her. That's an interesting idea, I said carefully. What kind of business were you thinking about? I don't know exactly, she admitted. Something online, maybe. E-commerce or consulting or one of those apps like you make. I'm a fast learner, and I think I could be really good at sales and marketing if someone could teach me the technical side. The proposal revealed how little she understood about what I actually did, or how business success actually worked. She thought entrepreneurship was something you could learn quickly from someone else, that technical skills could be transferred like recipes, that sales and marketing were natural talents rather than developed competencies that required years of practice and failure to master. More fundamentally, she thought our relationship was something that could be rebuilt around mutual benefit, that I would be willing to invest my time and knowledge in her success because family members were supposed to help each other achieve their goals. She had apparently forgotten that family help was exactly what I had needed 3 years ago when they decided Amanda's wedding was more important than my education. Building a successful business takes a lot more than learning technical skills, I said slowly. It requires understanding markets, managing risk, developing systems, building relationships with clients and vendors. Most importantly, it requires being able to handle failure and rejection and setbacks without anyone else to fall back on. I can handle that, she said quickly. I've been through enough lately to know I'm stronger than I thought, and having you as a mentor would give me advantages that most people starting out don't have. The assumption that I would become her mentor, that my success was somehow available to be shared with family members who asked nicely enough, demonstrated exactly why our relationship could never be repaired. She still saw my resources as family assets that could be accessed through the right combination of need and persuasion, rather than personal achievements that belonged entirely to the person who had earned them. Amanda, I appreciate that you're going through a difficult time, I said, choosing my words carefully. But I'm not in a position to take on mentoring responsibilities right now. My business requires complete focus, and I've found that mixing family relationships with professional obligations creates complications that usually don't work out well for anyone involved. The rejection was polite but absolute, delivered in the kind of corporate language that made clear this was a business decision rather than an emotional response. I had learned to communicate in ways that left no room for negotiation or misinterpretation, skills that had proven valuable in both professional and personal contexts. But I'm your sister, she said, her voice rising with the particular outrage of someone who had been denied something she considered her birthright. Family is supposed to help family. Isn't that what you always said you wanted? For us to support each other? The appeal to family loyalty was rich, coming from someone who had watched our parents steal my college fund to pay for her wedding without raising a single objection. But more than that, it revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of what support actually meant. Support wasn't one person giving everything to another person who had proven incapable of reciprocating. Support was mutual investment in each other's success, shared sacrifice for collective benefit, protection of each other's dreams, even when those dreams required personal inconvenience. Family support goes both ways, I replied. Where was your support when Mom and Dad decided to use my college fund for your wedding expenses? Where was your concern for my dreams when they were being sacrificed for your happiness? The question hung in the air like an accusation, finally spoken aloud after 3 years of careful avoidance. We had never directly discussed her role in the decision to steal my education funding, never acknowledged that she could have stopped it with a single word, never confronted the reality that her wedding had been built on my unwilling sacrifice. "That was different," she said defensively. "I didn't know they were going to do that until after it was already decided. And by then, all the deposits were paid, all the contracts were signed. It would have been impossible to cancel everything." The lie was so transparent that it insulted both our intelligence. She had been present for the kitchen table conversation where they announced their decision. She had participated in wedding planning meetings where my college fund was discussed as a funding source. She had signed contracts and made deposits, knowing exactly where the money was coming from and whose future was being mortgaged to pay for her perfect day. "You could have said no," I said quietly. "You could have told them to find another way, or to scale back the wedding to something they could afford without stealing from me. You chose not to." "I was 26 years old and getting married," she protested. "It was the most important day of my life. I wasn't thinking about college finances or long-term consequences. I was thinking about starting my life with Tyler and wanting everything to be perfect." The explanation was honest in a way that cut deeper than any lie could have. She hadn't been thinking about me at all. My education, my future, my dreams, none of it had registered as worthy of consideration when weighed against her desire for a perfect wedding day. I had been erased from her decision-making process so completely that she genuinely seemed to believe she bore no responsibility for the choice to sacrifice my college fund for her celebration. "And now you want me to think about your future," I said. "You want me to invest my time and knowledge and connections in helping you build a business and career. You want me to prioritize your success the way you weren't willing to prioritize mine." The parallel was stark enough that even Amanda couldn't miss it. She was asking me to make exactly the kind of sacrifice for her benefit that she had been unwilling to make for mine, except this time the sacrifice would be voluntary rather than stolen, and the person being asked had the power to say no. "That's not the same thing," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "This would be helping each other. We'd both benefit if I became successful." "How would I benefit?" I asked. "What exactly would you be offering in return for business mentoring, technical training, and access to my professional network?" The question clearly hadn't occurred to her. She had approached this conversation thinking only about what she needed and what I could provide, without considering what she might offer in exchange, or whether such an arrangement would be beneficial for anyone other than herself. "We'd be working together," she said weakly, "building something as a family." "We had a chance to work together as a family 3 years ago," I replied. "You chose a wedding over my education. I chose independence over continued disappointment. I'm comfortable with how those choices worked out." The conversation ended shortly after that exchange, with Amanda hanging up in frustration and me returning to work with the satisfaction of having drawn clear boundaries around my time and resources. She had tested whether my success had made me more willing to accept the family dynamic that had defined our childhood, and I had demonstrated that prosperity had actually made me less tolerant of one-sided relationships, not more generous toward people who had proven themselves untrustworthy. But the real revelation from Amanda's call wasn't her continued sense of entitlement to my resources. It was my complete lack of anger or hurt in response to her request. 3 years ago, her casual dismissal of my needs would have devastated me. Now it felt like watching a stranger make a poor business proposal, interesting as a case study in human behavior, but irrelevant to my actual life and decisions. The emotional distance I had achieved wasn't bitterness or revenge. It was the natural result of building a life so fulfilling and secure that other people's approval or disapproval couldn't affect my fundamental well-being. Success, it turned out, was the best therapy. When you had proof of your own worth demonstrated, through concrete achievements and financial independence, other people's opinions became advisory rather than determinative. 2 months later, I received a letter from Mom that managed to be both heartbreaking and infuriating in equal measure. Written on stationery that looked expensive but felt cheap, the kind of thing you might buy at a grocery store to make important. Communications seemed more formal. It was clearly intended as a final attempt to bridge the gap between us through emotional appeal rather than logical argument. The letter began with news about their living situation, updates about Amanda's divorce proceedings, and general family information delivered in the tone of someone trying to maintain normal correspondence despite extraordinary circumstances. But the real purpose became clear in the final paragraphs, where Mom's careful composure gave way to raw desperation. "I know we made mistakes with the college fund situation," she wrote. "I know you feel we prioritized Amanda's needs over yours, and I understand why that hurt you. But we were trying to do what seemed best for the family at the time, and we never imagined it would lead to this kind of permanent distance between us." The apology was carefully constructed to acknowledge my feelings without accepting responsibility for causing them. They had made mistakes, but those mistakes were errors in judgment rather than moral failings. I felt prioritized, but that feeling might not reflect the reality of their intentions. The permanent distance was unfortunate, but it was framed as an overreaction to circumstances rather than a natural consequence of their choices. "We're proud of everything you've accomplished," the letter continued. "More proud than we probably know how to express. But we're also sad that your success has come at the cost of our family relationships. We miss the daughter who used to come to Sunday dinners and share her plans and dreams with us. We miss being part of your life and having you be part of ours." The nostalgia was manipulative in its selectivity, remembering only the positive aspects of our family dynamic while ignoring the systematic favoritism and casual dismissal that had defined my childhood. Yes, I had attended Sunday dinners and shared my plans and dreams, but I had also watched those dreams be considered less important than Amanda's whenever resource allocation decisions needed to be made. "I'm writing to ask if there's any way we can rebuild what we've lost," Mom concluded. "Not for money or help with our current problems, but just to have our daughter back. You've proven that you don't need us, but maybe we need you more than we realized. Maybe family isn't about what we can do for each other, but about loving each other despite our mistakes and failures." The letter ended with an invitation to Thanksgiving dinner, presented as an opportunity for reconciliation and fresh starts. She included their new address, a small apartment in a part of Riverside I remembered as being populated by struggling families and recent immigrants. The return address itself was a stark reminder of how far their circumstances had fallen since the days when they could afford to spend my college fund on Amanda's wedding. I read the letter 3 times, analyzing each paragraph for manipulation techniques and emotional appeals, dissecting the language choices and underlying assumptions. But when I was finished with the analytical exercise, I found myself thinking about the mother who had helped me with science fair projects, who had driven me to robotics competitions, who had celebrated my academic achievements even when they didn't understand their significance. That mother had been real, even if she had existed alongside the mother who systematically prioritized Amanda's needs over mine. The question was whether reconciliation was possible without returning to the family dynamic that had made reconciliation necessary in the first place. I drafted 3 different responses to her letter over the course of a week, each representing a different approach to managing the relationship going forward. The first was cordial but distant, maintaining minimal contact while declining any deeper engagement. The second was brutally honest about the harm they had done and the changes that would be required for any meaningful relationship to develop. The third was completely forgiving, accepting their apology and agreeing to rebuild family connections as if the past 3 years had been an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than a necessary period of growth and independence. In the end, I sent none of them. Instead, I called Mom directly on a Tuesday evening when I knew Dad would be home from work and they could talk together if necessary. "Jessica?" Mom's voice carried surprise and hope in equal measure. "I wasn't sure you'd..." "Gotten my letter." "I got it," I said. "I've been thinking about what you wrote, about rebuilding family relationships and moving past what happened with the college fund." I could hear her breathing change, the way people sound when they're trying not to get their hopes up but can't help feeling optimistic. "And what did you decide?" "I've decided that I'm open to having a relationship with you and Dad," I said slowly. "But it would have to be a different kind of relationship than what we had before. It would have to be based on mutual respect and recognition that I'm an adult who makes my own decisions about my time, money, and priorities." "Of course," she said quickly. "We understand that. We know you've built your own life, and you don't need us the way you used to." The response revealed that she still didn't understand the fundamental issue. It wasn't that I didn't need them the way I used to. It was that I had never needed them to make my decisions for me or to sacrifice my interests for other family members. What I had needed was support and protection and investment in my dreams, the same things they had provided for Amanda without question or limitation. "It's not about needing you differently," I said. "It's about you respecting my boundaries and accepting that our relationship is voluntary rather than obligatory. I won't be contributing to family financial emergencies. I won't be providing business advice or career assistance to family members. And I won't be expected to put family gatherings or obligations ahead of my own priorities." The silence that followed was long enough for me to wonder if she was still on the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller, more uncertain than it had been at the beginning of our conversation. "Those seem like reasonable boundaries," she said carefully. "We just want to have you in our lives again, even if it's different than it used to be. And I want to be clear about Amanda," I continued. "I'm willing to be civil with her at family gatherings, but I'm not interested in rebuilding a close relationship with someone who watched you steal my college fund without objecting." That decision permanently changed how I think about her character and priorities. This time, the silence was shorter, but more charged. Mom had probably hoped that time and success had softened my feelings toward Amanda, that family reconciliation would include forgiving and forgetting all the harm that had been done. "She was young," Mom said quietly. "She made mistakes, but she's learned from them. The divorce, the financial problems, it's all taught her things about what really matters." "Maybe it has," I agreed. "But her education isn't my responsibility. She'll have to demonstrate those changes through her actions over time, not through my willingness to give her another chance to disappoint me." We talked for another 20 minutes, establishing ground rules for limited re-engagement that would allow us to maintain family connections without returning to the dynamics that had made separation necessary. I would attend major family gatherings when my schedule allowed, but I wouldn't feel obligated to prioritize family events over business or personal commitments. They could share general updates about their lives, but they wouldn't ask for my advice about financial decisions or career choices. We would treat each other with the courtesy extended to distant relatives, rather than the intimacy expected between parents and children. It wasn't the reunion Mom had probably hoped for when she wrote her letter, but it was more than they had any right to expect, given the circumstances that had led to our estrangement. Family relationships, I had learned, were like business partnerships. They only worked when all parties brought value to the arrangement and respected each other's boundaries and priorities. Thanksgiving dinner at their small apartment was exactly as awkward as I had anticipated, but it was also oddly liberating. Sitting around their tiny table, eating a meal that probably cost less than my usual business lunches, I felt like an anthropologist observing a culture I had once belonged to, but no longer quite understood. Amanda was there with Tyler, who looked older and more defeated than I remembered from their engagement party 3 years earlier. They were polite to each other in the way of people who were going through the motions of marriage, while lawyers worked out the details of its dissolution. The golden couple who had seemed so perfect during their wedding planning now looked like strangers trapped in a relationship that neither of them wanted to continue but couldn't afford to end quickly. Dad asked careful questions about my business, clearly fascinated by the success I had achieved, but uncertain about how much interest he was allowed to express. Mom served dinner with the nervous energy of someone hosting a dinner party for people she didn't know well, trying too hard to make conversation and fill silences that might have been comfortable if everyone had relaxed enough to let them happen naturally. The most telling moment came when Amanda tried to engage me in conversation about business opportunities she was exploring. Her tone was casual, but I could hear the underlying hope that our renewed family contact might open doors to the mentoring relationship she had requested months earlier. "I've been looking into online retail," she said while we cleared dishes after dinner. "There seems to be a lot of potential in e-commerce, especially for people who understand marketing and customer service." I nodded politely and offered neutral responses that acknowledged her comments without encouraging further discussion. After a few minutes of receiving minimal engagement, she gave up and turned her attention to helping Mom with dessert preparations. The interaction was a perfect test of my new boundaries, and I was pleased to discover that maintaining professional distance felt natural rather than forced. Driving home to Austin that evening, I reflected on the strange experience of returning to my family as a completely different person than the one who had left. The daughter who had sat at their kitchen table 3 years earlier, devastated by their betrayal and uncertain about her future, was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that love without respect was manipulation, that family loyalty without reciprocity was exploitation, and that success earned independently was more valuable than anything given by people who could decide to take it away. The reconciliation, limited as it was, felt like closure rather than reunion. I now had definitive proof that our relationship could never return to its original form, but also that some connection was possible if everyone accepted the new terms and respected the boundaries that made those terms sustainable. We would never be the close family that holiday movies celebrated, but we could be the kind of distant relatives who exchanged pleasantries at gatherings and maintained polite interest in each other's general well-being. 6 months later, I bought my parents' apartment building. Not to help them or to make some grand gesture of reconciliation, but because it was a solid investment opportunity in a neighborhood that was beginning to show signs of gentrification. The fact that my monthly rental income from the property exceeded my parents' annual household income was a coincidence that I found privately amusing but never mentioned to them directly. They learned about my ownership when the building management company sent out notices about upcoming renovations and improvements. Mom called to ask if I knew anything about the new ownership, and I confirmed that yes, I was now their landlord, but that their lease terms wouldn't change, and they shouldn't expect any special treatment or consideration because of our family relationship. "You bought our building?" she asked, her voice carrying a mixture of amazement and confusion. "I bought an investment property," I corrected. "The fact that you happen to live in it is irrelevant to the business decision." It was the perfect encapsulation of how our relationship had evolved. They existed in my world now, but as tenants rather than family members whose needs took priority over my own interests. I would treat them fairly and professionally, but I would never again allow family obligation to override business logic or personal boundaries. The girl who had once wanted nothing more than their approval and investment had become a woman who owned the building they lived in, employed more people than they had ever supervised, and generated more wealth in a month than they would accumulate in a lifetime. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and more satisfying than any college degree could have provided. Amanda's divorce was finalized 8 months after Thanksgiving dinner, leaving her with minimal assets and no clear plan for supporting herself independently. She moved back in with our parents, becoming a 30-year-old woman living in her childhood bedroom, dependent on people who could barely afford to support themselves, let alone an adult child with expensive tastes and no marketable skills. I learned these details through Mom's carefully neutral updates, delivered in the tone of someone sharing family news rather than asking for assistance. But I could hear the underlying stress in her voice, the worry about how they would manage. with an additional mouth to feed and no additional income to support it. Amanda never called me directly again after our business mentoring conversation, apparently having accepted that our relationship would remain permanently distant. But I sometimes wondered if she understood the irony of her situation. Living in a building I owned while struggling with financial problems I could solve with a phone call, dependent on parents whose current circumstances were largely the result of decisions made to benefit her 3 years earlier. The mathematics of justice continued to play out in ways that felt almost scripted. They had chosen Amanda's immediate happiness over my long-term success, and now they were all living with the consequences of that choice, while I thrived in ways that none of them had imagined possible. The college fund they had stolen had been $45,000, money that was supposed to launch my adult life and career. The business empire I had built to replace it was now worth over $4 million and growing at a rate that compounded their original betrayal every month. But the real victory wasn't financial, though the money certainly provided satisfying validation. The real victory was the complete emotional independence I had achieved, the ability to observe their struggles with sympathy but without obligation, to wish them well without feeling responsible for their well-being, to maintain family connections without sacrificing personal boundaries or priorities. I had learned the most valuable lesson anyone could learn, that other people's love and approval were luxuries rather than necessities, that family relationships were healthiest when they were chosen rather than obligated, and that the best revenge against people who underestimated you wasn't revenge at all, but simply becoming so successful that their underestimation became impossible to ignore or rationalize away. 3 years after they had told me I was smart enough to figure things out on my own, I had figured out more than they ever dreamed possible. I had built a life so complete and secure that their presence in it was optional rather than essential, so successful that their approval was irrelevant rather than desperately sought. The girl who had once believed that family love was unconditional had learned that it was often the most conditional love of all, dependent on your willingness to accept whatever role they assigned you and whatever sacrifices they decided you should make. But she had also learned that independence was its own form of love, that self-respect was more valuable than other people's affection, and that success achieved entirely on your own terms was the sweetest success of all. They had taught me to be strong by forcing me to be strong. They had taught me to be independent by abandoning me when I needed them most. They had taught me to value my own judgment by demonstrating how unreliable their support could be. And for those lessons, painful as they had been to learn, I would always be grateful. The future stretched ahead like an open road, full of possibilities that belonged entirely to me because I had earned them entirely through my own efforts. And that future, built on the ashes of everything they had decided I didn't deserve, was worth more than any college education they could have funded or any family relationship they could have preserved. Sometimes the best thing a family can do for you is force you to outgrow your need for them. And sometimes the greatest gift is discovering that you're capable of more than anyone ever believed possible, including yourself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.